I'm Bill McDonald. I'm the program chair for Poolsville Seniors. That's Beth Parker back there who's checking people in. She's the program manager for us, and she's really the person that gets everything done. I just get to take the credit for it. I'm sanitized for your protection this evening. I have a bit of a cold going on right now, and I don't want to give it to anybody. So that's the reason I'm not trying to hide my face. And of course, my wife will tell you that like all men, I'm a good silent sufferer. I don't make any noise about it. Anyway, let me introduce Brad Stone. This is time number 5.
Yes.
Fifth time Brad has come out and done a historic talk for us. And Brad is a docent. Besides just being a really all-around good historian, he's a docent at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine up in Frederick, and at the U.S. Constellation in Baltimore Harbor, where John had the privilege of being able to spend a very frigid night sleeping in one of the hammocks in that with his Boy Scout troop about 2 weeks ago, right? All right. Well, anyway, Brad, I'm going to let you tell us all about your presentation for tonight.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming out. I was just questioned by this young lady here about the history of the Navy, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize the tremendous contribution the U.S. Navy or the Union Navy made in winning the Civil War. And I'm going to focus on one particularly important aspect of that tonight, and that is the way they incorporated black sailors into the Navy and how they used them. And the story of how those sailors really excelled and played really an indispensable part of the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. And I think part of the problem is, again, the good news is that in recent years there's more of an awareness of the role that blacks played in the Union Army, thanks to movies like, Glory and other representations of that contribution. But not much is known about their contribution to the Navy because there's, again, this larger problem of people not even knowing there was a Union Navy during the Civil War. So we'll be touching on a number of issues during this presentation. So let's begin with the first slide, please. This second one, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm going to deal with two things that aren't really often known. And one is what's known as either the U.S. Africa or African Squadron, it's known by both terms, that existed before the Civil War, which really was the first attempt by the United States government to free enslaved people. And again, this occurred before the Civil War. And I'll explain a little bit more about that effort in a second. And then the other thing I'll be talking about, again, is how over the course of the Civil War, blacks are brought more and more into the United States Navy and will eventually play an enormous role in the Union or United States Navy. Next slide, please. So first, let's deal with the U.S. Africa Squadron. What is it? Well, it is a part of the United States Navy that is designed to sail along the coast of West Africa to intercept slave ships and to free the enslaved people aboard them. Now, how did that come into place? Well, in 1808, the United States enacts a law that forbids American ships from engaging in the international slave trade. So what does that mean and what doesn't it mean? Well, I'll talk about what it doesn't mean first. That law in no way inhibits the slave trade within the United States. So slaves could be readily sold from person to person across state lines. It didn't matter. So slavery was an institution in the United States. That law did not affect it. However, what it did prohibit is the importation of any more slaves into the United States. It prohibited any American ship from engaging in the slave trade anywhere in the world. So under the terms of that law and some international agreements, the United States was required to establish an African squadron that would, again, cruise off the coast of West Africa and to intercept slave ships and to arrest those who were running those slave ships. Now, in reality, for many decades, these American African squadrons were kind of like token exercises. These squadrons weren't very big. They really couldn't effectively do their job. But by the 1850s, thanks to a lot of pressure from the British, who were very engaged in the idea of destroying the international slave trade. I'm going to make a little aside here. Probably the most powerful force in terms of destroying the slave trade throughout the 19th century was the British government. Even though at one time Britain had been involved in the slave trade, by the time they outlawed slavery in the 1830s on, they were the predominant force throughout the world in ridding the world of slavery. And one of the ways they did that is they had a very active African squadron of their own, much bigger than ours. But there was a problem with that. And that is, under the terms of the Treaty of 1812, British ships were not allowed to board any ship that was flying the U.S. flag. So guess what slavers did? They frequently flew the U.S. flag. The British are incensed about that, and they finally pressured the United States in the 1850s to finally send a potent force to the west coast of Africa. And that African squadron would be under the Buchanan administration. And one more thing I want to point out. People often have the misconception that the only nation that was involved in the slave trade was the United States. If you look at that chart on the right, you'll see that as horrible as the slave trade is, as terrible as it is that the United States was engaged in slavery and the slave trade, it represented only a minuscule amount of that slave trade. As you can see through that picture, fully 94% of the slave trade didn't go to North America. It went to the Caribbean and South America. So it's important to bear in mind that even though the United States was finished importing slaves, still much of the world was still engaged very actively in their practice. Okay, so next slide, please. So in the 1850s, there was a new squadron, a much bigger squadron, and its flagship is the USS Constellation, the very same one that is in Baltimore Harbor. That ship is not only the last remaining ship of the Civil War, it's also the last remaining ship of the African squadron. And indeed, its service in the African squadron is regarded by many as the glory days of that ship. So it and its sister ships, in the space of 2 years, from 1859 to 1861, which is when the Civil War breaks out, in those 2 years, they are able to capture 14 slave ships and free about 4,000 people that would have gone into slavery. An enormous accomplishment. Now, how does it work? Well, basically, the way it would work is that they would see a slave ship, they would intercept it, they would arrest the people on the ship, running the ship, and then they would put what was called a prize crew aboard that ship. It would consist of a few officers and enough men to operate that slave ship. They would sail the slave ship to Liberia on the African coast because that was a free territory. They're not going to sail it back to where it came from because then those people would have just been re-enslaved. They sell it to Liberia and those people are freed. Then they take that ship and they will sail it usually to New York. The crew of that slave ship will be put on trial. If you were a captain of a slave ship, theoretically, you could be hanged, and in a couple of cases, the captains were hanged. The crew could also be subject to trial and punishment. And the ship itself would go up for sale, for auction. And the proceeds from that sale, in part, would go to the U.S. Treasury, but a large part of it would be going to the crew that captured the ship. And that was split up among the men by rank, but even the lowest person on that ship, the amount of money they received from that prize would often exceed their yearly pay. So that gave a real incentive for the crews aboard the African squadron to intercept as many ships as they could. So this is an enormous accomplishment, but bear in mind the men that were aboard these ships were hardened sailors. They'd seen and done a lot of things, but even they were horrified by the conditions they found aboard these vessels that they captured. Indeed, one of the sailors aboard the Constellation, a longtime sailor, again, a very tough guy. You can see his quote here. "It was a dreadful sight. The enslaved were packed together like many sheep, men, women, and children, entirely naked, suffering from hunger and thirst, having nothing to eat or drink for over 30 hours. Now bear in mind, the average time for most of these transatlantic journeys of enslaved people were from 4 to 6 weeks. So can you imagine living under these conditions? And by the way, his description is not as graphic as it could be. So again, these men of the squadron performed an amazing feat. Next slide, please. And again, the Constellation was the flagship during this time, and it's still in Baltimore Harbor. I advise you to go see it. It's a magnificent ship. It has a magnificent history. It's one of the few ships that was commissioned for over 100 years. It is also the ship, when the Civil War starts, the Navy needs all the ships back in the United States as quickly as possible. So it's ordered back to the United States. And on its way back, it just so happens to intercept a slave ship, and it's called the Triton. And it was registered in South Carolina, and the war has already begun. So by virtue of capturing this Confederate ship, because South Carolina is part of the Confederacy, in essence, it wins the first naval victory for the United States. Beyond that, during the Civil War itself, 15 black sailors serve on the crew, including one by the name of Jack Evans, who will serve as the coxswain of the ship, only one of 7. That's a pretty high rank in the Navy at that time. So it's a very historic ship, and again, I recommend that you visit it. Next slide, please. So the fact that there are black sailors aboard the Constellation allows me to segue to the next part of this talk, and that is the contributions of black sailors themselves. So one of the unique features about the United States Navy, much different than the Army, was from its very beginning, the Navy had black sailors. The regular U.S. Army had no black soldiers in it until the Civil War. But well before the Civil War, there were quite a number of black sailors in the U.S. Navy, and they particularly served with distinction during the War of 1812. In fact, in the decades leading up to the Civil War, there were so many blacks serving in the Navy that due to the prevailing prejudices of the time, the Congress forced the Navy to put a 5% cap on the number of sailors, black sailors, that could serve in the Navy. And that remained in place until the Civil War. But when the Civil War started, that was completely thrown off. And by the way, I should say, blacks serving in the Navy, these are free blacks. You couldn't be an enslaved black and come to the Navy. But if you were free black, you were more than welcome in the Navy for much of its history. So the Civil War starts. Now the Navy needs all the skilled men it can use, and the racial distinction falls by the wayside. So immediately when the war starts, the Navy has about 42 ships that are serviceable. By the end of the Civil War, just 4 years later, they'll have almost 700, making it one of the world's largest navies. So you can understand how they really needed to get every man they could to, deal with this vast expansion. So they start recruiting a large number of blacks, and that's all well and good, but the big problem of the Civil War is most black people are not free. The overwhelming number of the 4 million blacks in this country are actually enslaved. So the big question of the Civil War is, how's the military, the Union military, going to deal with these enslaved people or these people seeking freedom who have escaped slavery? Next slide, please. So they're going to take different paths. And the Navy, from the outset of the war, takes a much more open or much more accepting approach to these people. From the very beginning of the Civil War, when the Navy comes across enslaved people, they offer them protection and they start putting them to work, offering them work in doing sort of basic tasks to assist the Navy. They're not bringing them formally into the Navy, but to a large extent, they're kind of taking them under their wing. And in fact, the Navy in July of 1861 takes the unprecedented step of kind of formally augmenting its crews with escaping enslaved people. Bear in mind the date, 1861. This is well before the Emancipation Proclamation. On the other hand, the U.S. Army takes a much different approach. It kind of depends on who's the commander. Some Army commanders, like Benjamin Butler, take a very accepting approach to escaped blacks. They bring them in, he puts them to work, he protects them. Other commanders want to have nothing to do with them and won't even protect them. They still regard them as the property of, Southerners. So again, this attitude to what are called contrabands, and I'll explain that term if you want me to. Do you want me to explain that term? Okay. So again, the status of people that escaped in the very early part of the war, before the Emancipation Proclamation, is open to question. The Federal Fugitive Slave Act is still technically in effect. So some in the Union say, okay, well, if a slave comes to us, he's still the property of the owner, and under the Fugitive Slave Act, we have to return him to the owner. Well, Benjamin Butler is a commander, Union commander. He also has to be a lawyer, happens to be a lawyer, and these Confederate or these slave holders come to him because they know he's harboring some slaves, and they say, well, under the terms of the law, you have to return them. He goes, you support the Confederacy, right? And they go, absolutely. He goes, well, then you're the enemy, and under the laws of war, I, as your enemy, can keep your property or your contraband. So guess what? Now they're mine. And so they came to be called contraband because in the eyes of the law, that was the way you could withhold them from the enemy, prevent them from going back as slaves. So that was the common term used for these people. But as the name kind of implies, they're still kind of in limbo. You're not really recognizing them as free people. You're just representing them or regarding them as property that you have custody of and can, hold against returning them to their masters. So again, I'm going to be using the term contraband to talk about these people who are in limbo. They've escaped, but are they regarded as citizens? Not really. Are they regarded as soldiers or sailors? Not really. They're kind of in this limbo. Well, the Navy very early on says, okay, we're going to offer them protection, and we're going to start using them to help our crews, okay? So that's a noteworthy step at that time. They're going in a different direction than the Army. They're going, to be honest with you, in a different direction than the overall Lincoln administration, which still hasn't made up its mind what to do. Next slide, please. So things start to happen very quickly during that summer because these freed blacks are doing great jobs, and naval commanders are noticing it. They seem to be very dedicated. A lot of them seem to be very skilled, and there's this real need for the Navy to get more and more men in its ranks. So a lot of the commanders start pressing for these for these contrabands to be formally inducted into the Navy. The Navy at the time is headed up by Gideon Welles. He's the Secretary of the Navy. Before the war, he had been a publisher, and he's also a very strong abolitionist. So he's very sympathetic to this idea that blacks should be allowed in the Navy, even if they're escaped blacks. So again, he takes an amazing leap here. In September of 1861, he formally allows blacks to be inducted into the United States Navy. Now, albeit they're going to be at the lowest ranks. They're going to be brought in as boys. And they're going to be doing the dirtiest and most, physically taxing labor. By 21st century standards, we would say, gee, that's terrible, that's not fair. But by 19th century standards, at this point in the war, that's an extraordinary act to do because it does a number of things. First of all, it makes them part of the Navy. It takes them out of this contraband limbo. They will never go back to slavery. They can't. They're part of the U.S. Navy now. Second of all, they're being paid. And they're being paid at rates that they would, they were slaves before they were paid nothing, but even as free black men on contrabands, the pay they're getting in the Navy is far in excess of what they could have imagined ever getting in the near term. And the other thing that's noteworthy is the Navy kind of leaves it open whether commanders can segregate their crews, but in reality, they rarely do not because they're great guys and they believe in civil rights and they're altruistic, but how are you going to segregate a ship? If you go aboard the Constellation, you see it's a ship that contains hundreds of men and it's not very well compartmentalized. They're all kind of with each other. So even if you wanted to segregate it, you couldn't. But most of them don't even want to bother to do that. And even in terms of some of the most highly prized rituals aboard the ship, and the highest one is the grog ration. That's the part of the day everybody lines up and gets their ration of grog, which consists of whiskey and water. That's the highlight of their day. Well, blacks are allowed to be in that line along with any other man. So in many ways, the Navy is far ahead of its time in not only allowing blacks in, but pretty much being integrated. Next slide, please. So I'm painting a pretty rosy picture here, but there's some problems with it. And one of the concerns some of the officers have are how the enlisted men are going to take it, the white enlisted men. And some of them don't take it very well. So initially when, like, white sailors, enlisted men, see, enslaved blacks, they have a lot of sympathy for them, and they can kind of relate to them because they think, the white sailors think of themselves as being kind of at the low end of the socioeconomic ladder. They're not treated very well, so they can kind of relate to these enslaved people. But then when those newly freed people become part of the Navy, fellow sailors, well, then some resentments start to build up because now, we're not one of the lowest rungs of the ladder. Now the people that were below us are equals, and they may rise above us. And so a lot of antipathy starts to develop among some white members of the crew to these new black sailors. Part of it's just based on plain old racism. Part of it's, again, because they're kind of anxious about the fact that their status may be, challenged. And then the other thing that starts to kind of percolate is they start to feel that officers in the Navy kind of look more kindly upon the new black sailors than they do upon the white sailors. Strangely enough, that might have some elements of truth in it. And again, it's not because white officers are altruistic or they believe in civil rights. No, it's a practical thing. The white officers start to notice that the new black sailors tend to have a stronger work ethic and tend to like being in the Navy. They're not as resentful of being in the Navy. and they tend to have a lot fewer discipline problems. So there's this tension that builds up among some white sailors, and in time this leads to what are called frictions, where they start to harass black sailors. Sometimes these can become violent, sometimes they lead to murders. Now, the Navy top brass is very keen on nipping that in the bud, and they take very stern action to prevent that from happening. And indeed, several white sailors who are guilty of murder are eventually hanged. Some of them are literally hanged by the yardarm. So they'll be dangling over a ship to make it clear that that's not going to be tolerated. Next slide, please. So there are also differences between different elements of the U.S. Navy or the Union Navy. So for the Blue Water Navy, which is what you see on the left side there, that's sort of the traditional Navy that goes out to sea around the world. That's the part of the Navy that during the Civil War will be chasing down Confederate raiding ships or that will be serving on the blockade across the southern coast. But then there's a new part, well, let me talk about their attitude. They're okay with black sailors by and large because they've always had black sailors, so it's no big deal. But there's a new type of Navy, which is called, we call it the Brown Navy or the Riverine Navy, which is made up of gunboats like that ironclad you see there. Those are operating in the inner waterways of America, rivers like the Mississippi, the Tennessee, that kind of environment. Well, many of the commanders in that Navy are dead set against having blacks serve aboard their ships for a number of reasons. Top of the list, because of the prevailing racism at the time. But they also have some practical reasons. One of those commanders is David Porter. And the concern is these ships are operating deep within Confederate territory. And they're nervous about the fact that if Southerners are seeing integrated crews going up and down their rivers, that's going to really stir them up. It may cause them to engage in guerrilla activity. And they're nervous about what could happen. So that's going to be one of the big tensions in this whole determination by the Navy of what they should do in terms of black sailors, what ships they should deploy them on. Next slide, please. Well, despite all these concerns, all these barriers, and all these other impediments, sailors, black sailors, start to be recognized as being very good sailors, not only by the officer corps, but by their fellow sailors. And in fact, in a very quick period of time, they start to assume higher positions, both in terms of responsibility and in terms of skill. You start to see them serve as carpenters, firemen, pilots, members of the night watch, and one of the most important things aboard a warship, and one of the more complex, is on the gun crew. When you go to the Constellation and you see the plaques there or talk to somebody there, you realize how complicated it is to be on a gun crew. Only the best of the best are allowed to serve on them. So by 1862, sailors make up nearly 25 to 50% of some ship crews in the Navy. And so it becomes obvious that they're good sailors. And because of this, again, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles will take another extraordinary act. What he will do is in December of 1862, he will allow blacks to enter the Navy as landsmen. That's the same rank that anyone would. Not only that, he goes beyond that. He will allow them to ascend to the rank of able seamen, and even to petty officer ranks. And all of these will be at the same pay level as white sailors. Now again, from the 21st century, we look at this, we say, well, that's just common sense. It's just, that's what you should do. But again, this is the 19th century. This is seen as an extraordinary thing in the 19th century. And in fact, if you look at the Army, at this time in the war, again, the U.S. Army really doesn't have any recognized black units in it at all. Moreover, after the Emancipation Proclamation, when they start to bring large numbers of blacks into the U.S. Army, they're not paying them at the same level as white soldiers, significantly lower. And that won't really change until Congress forces them to do it in 1864. So again, this is an extraordinary step by the Union Navy. Next slide, please. And as they become a regular part of the United States Navy, blacks really serve with distinction in so many ways. And you will see them really do a great job in combat, to the extent that 7 of them will ultimately earn the nation's highest medal, the Medal of Honor. And in fact, later, well, I should say in March, on March 23rd, there'll be a ceremony on board the USS Constellation to recognize one of these black sailors who was originally born in Cape Verde. He wasn't even a U.S. citizen, but he was a sailor in the U.S. Navy, and he would win the Congressional Medal of Honor. So their performance is so good that when the Army finally allows black soldiers into its midst, they're trying to figure out, well, can they serve as gun crews? So what do? Well, their adjutant general goes to the Navy and says, can blacks serve in gun crews? And the Navy responds, yeah, they can handle them very well. And even the biggest skeptic of all, Admiral Porter, by this point, when asked how black sailors do, responds, they do first rate. So even this skeptic has been won over by their performance. Next slide, please. But there's a paradox. And it's brought about because the Navy is integrated, and when the Army brings in its soldiers, they're rigidly segregated. They're segregated into what's known as the United States Colored Troops. So if you're in the 19th century and you say to somebody, is it okay to have a black officer give orders to other blacks? The answer is, yeah, I guess that's okay. If you say to them, is it okay to have a Navy officer, black Navy officer, who would be giving orders to blacks and whites? Is that okay? Well, for many, the answer is no. So because the Army is segregated, they are allowed some officers during the Civil War. Because the Navy is integrated, they are not allowed any commissioned officers and will not have any commissioned officers until World War II. That's one of the first of 12, Ensign William White. So that's one of the paradoxes of the way the Army and the Navy are set up during the Civil War. Next slide, please. However, there is one exception to that, and it's an extraordinary exception indeed. It's this gentleman, Robert Smalls, one of the greatest heroes of the Civil War. He is a slave. He is working for the Confederate Navy as what they would call a wheelman. He's actually a pilot, but they don't want to acknowledge it, so they just call him a wheelman. He's the guy that steers the ship, navigates it through Charleston Harbor, and the ship he serves on is a Confederate ship called the Planter. You see it over there in that slide. And he doesn't want to be a slave. He doesn't want his family to be enslaved. So he comes up with a plan. He's going to, as he put it, borrow the ship and sail it to the Union blockade force that's off the coast of Charleston. That is a daring plan because he's got to figure out how to get the ship. Fortunately, the Confederate officers of that ship help him out greatly because one night they decide to leave it unattended. Not only that, but the captain even leaves his frock coat, a gray one, on board the ship. And, Smalls has been planning this out. So he has the opportunity, grabs his family, grabs some friends, they get aboard the ship, they go out of Charleston Harbor. Fortunately, he knows it like the back of his hand. The other thing he knows like the back of his hands are the signals you're supposed to get when the coastal defenses are asking, giving you permission to go in and out of the harbor. So he knows the signals, and he's also wearing the officer's cap, frock coat, and his hat. So from a distance, he looks like the Confederate commander of the ship. Now, it's still, a daunting task to get out of the harbor, past those defenses. But even once he does that, he's still in great danger because there's a Union blockading force, about a mile off the coast. They see this Confederate vessel heading for them. What do you think they're going to do? Well, they're going to open fire on it. So what he has to do is he times it perfectly. Just when he gets beyond the range of the Confederate defenses, he pulls down the Confederate flag. He pulls up a white flag that he's made out of like a bed sheet, and it's still risky because, the Union force may think it's a trick or something. Fortunately, the commander of the nearest ship, it's called the USS Onward, decides to take a chance, and he is shocked when the ship pulls alongside, and it's a crew made up entirely of black men, which has, a couple of black families on it, plus it's loaded down with all this military equipment. And, Small says words to the effect, hey, I just thought you'd want a lot of this stuff back. So he's warmly welcomed. He becomes a hero throughout the North. This one man stole an entire Confederate ship and all these Confederate, armaments. Lincoln has a personal audience with him and is so impressed that that's one of the deciding factors that leads Lincoln to really encourage the recruitment of a lot of freed black men into the Union Army. So it has a tremendous effect on Union morale and on deciding the question of whether blacks can serve in the United States forces. Smalls himself will be given that boat by the United States government. He will serve throughout the war in aiding both the Army and the Navy in its prosecution of the war. He will never get a formal commission as a captain, but Congress will give him the same pay and the same pension as a naval captain. And he will go on after the war to become a United States congressman and to hold several other major positions following the Civil War. Next slide, please. Now, no talk about the United States Navy and the role that blacks played in it would be complete without talking about the Navy's first nurses. During the Civil War, the Navy had a unique solution to a problem that really plagued the armed forces in the western sector of the war. Very often, men would be fighting in remote areas, and it would take hundreds and hundreds of miles to get them to first-class medical treatment. Well, the United States Navy took a bold approach in changing that, and they did so in 1863 when they developed one of the world's first modern hospital ships, the USN Red Rover. Red Rover is kind of an interesting story. It had been a Confederate steamship. It was captured by the Union Army. The Union Army hands it over to the United States Navy, and the United States Navy converts it into a first-class hospital. Has cutting-edge, surgery rooms, elevators. It can hold, tons of ice. Really a first-class hospital that floats. What's significant about it is for the first time now men who are wounded on the battlefield don't have to go hundreds of miles to a hospital. Now a first-class hospital can come close to the battlefield. Now, one of the most unique features about this hospital is the first time that the United States Navy will have a professional nursing staff. made up of female nurses. And the composition of that staff is interesting. The administrators are Catholic nuns, but the actual nuns themselves are newly freed black women. And they, over the course of the Red Rover's history, during the Civil War, will treat over 3,000 men. So it's a remarkable ship. Now, one of the most famous of these nurses is Anne Bradford. She would later become Anne Bradford Stokes. She serves for some period of time aboard the ship. In 1890, she goes to the pension board for a pension. Now, if you've ever read about the U.S. Pension Board, they're pretty stingy. They don't give out pensions very easily. They give people a lot of hard time. But in her case, they do grant her a pension for her service aboard the Red Rover, and by doing so, they make her the first American woman to ever receive a pension for a naval service. You will, be careful to note, I didn't say the first black woman, just the first woman, period, to ever receive a pension for her naval service. So again, this is another example where the Navy is trying to be as open as possible so that they, can really further their objective. Next slide, please. So in looking at this whole presentation, I hope you come away with the following points. And that is, first of all, that this whole experience of blacks in the Civil War was built on an existing history of service even before the Civil War, going back to the earliest days of the United States Navy. Secondly, that the U.S. squadron was one of the few bright spots in the antebellum period of American history in terms of slavery. It's one of the first attempts to actually try to begin the process of ending slavery. Then the other thing is that the Navy was the first service to really provide unprecedented opportunities for free blacks to, fully establish their freedom, fully get status as people and as members of an American armed service, and to fight for their cause of freedom. And by the end of the Civil War, 18,000 blacks are serving in the Navy, and they constitute 20% of its enlisted force. So when I say that blacks are a big asset to the Navy, I should really be saying they're indispensable to the Navy, because I don't know how it would have operated without them in its ranks. And just so you understand, there were more blacks that served in the Union Army because it's a much bigger force. But again, in terms of a percentage, the Navy had almost twice as many blacks in terms of its service than the Union Army did. And then finally, black sailors and nurses really distinguished themselves through their perseverance, their dedication, and their courage, and their heroic sacrifice throughout the Civil War, and again before the Civil War, and as we know, after the Civil War. So with that, next slide, please. I think it's best summed up by the hero we already talked about, Robert Smalls. He said it, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of anyone. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." I won't tell you that the United States Navy during the Civil War gave them the perfect opportunity, but they did give them a very significant opportunity, and I think they should be recognized for that. So, next slide, please. Thank you very much. This is a summary of some of the sources I used for this presentation. I encourage you to read them. I think they'll offer you very good insight on this subject and about the U.S. Navy during the Civil War in general. Next slide. And this is how you can get in contact with me. I'd love to hear from you. And you know, I'm always available, and if I don't know, I'll research it. But anyway, I'd love to hear from you. Next slide, please. There is no slide, so I'll just say, I'm very good at ad-libbing. I'll just say I'm open for questions, so if anyone has any questions about anything, I'll be happy to answer them. I may even give you a somewhat accurate answer. So thank you very much. Oh, yes?
You mentioned that in 1808,
Yeah,
couldn't bring any more American ships hauling slaves.
yes,
And of course, the British had already ceased.
right.
But were there French, Spanish, Portuguese ships, and could they bring slaves to the U.S.?
No one could import slaves into the United States. Did they? Yeah, there were some people that still did it, but it was kind of a fringy sort of thing. The French in 1840 joined the anti-slavery movement, and they did participate, not to the same extent the British did in terms of having an African squadron, but they did. So they were out of the picture in terms of, you know, transporting slaves themselves. So yeah, but again, I can't emphasize enough. I'm not of British heritage and stuff like that, but they really did much of the work, both before, during, and after the Civil War, in terms of trying to eradicate slavery. Anyone else? Oh, yes, sir.
Could you talk about your uniform?
Oh, okay. In an earlier slide, I brought up Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. This is the kind of uniform he would have worn. He would have worn in 1864. The Navy is expanding so rapidly, they start creating new ranks. And so almost every year they start to change the rankings on their uniforms. So this would have been 1864. As I think I explained to somebody here, prior to the Civil War, the rank of admiral didn't exist in the U.S. Navy. The highest rank you could go to would be a commodore, and even that was an honorary rank. You're basically a captain, but you're recognized as being, you know, a little bit higher because you head up a squadron or you've attained a certain position in the Department of the Navy. So Civil War changes all that because you have a much larger Navy, you have more ships, you need more men, so they start creating different levels of ranks. And so again, throughout the war, in 1863, this would have been a different uniform. The striping, or lacing as they call it, would have been different. But that's what this uniform is all about. Porter is one of the first rear admirals, as I was explaining to someone. He actually jumped 2 ranks because Lincoln really liked him. So he went from being a commander to being a rear admiral. He was never a captain, and he was never a commodore. So